Rain drizzled against the glass outside, streaking the lights of New York into blurred ribbons. Inside the modest Italian restaurant, the warmth was deceptive. Candles glowed on each table, cutlery clinked softly, and the low hum of conversations carried a rhythm that felt almost like safety. But at a small table by the window, that sense of safety fractured into something sharp and cold. Claire Morgan sat alone, her purse resting on her lap, her fingers pressed tight around the strap. She had counted her money 3 times before leaving her apartment. $5. Just enough for the subway fare home if she stayed disciplined. Not enough for wine. Not enough for dinner. This blind date was supposed to be different. Supposed to be worth the risk of hope. Her phone vibrated against the wooden table. A single line glared from the screen. "Sorry, I'm not coming. Good luck." For a moment, the sound of the restaurant thinned out, as though someone had turned down the volume on the world. The violin track playing softly over the speakers felt like mockery. Claire's chest tightened, her breath shallow, her eyes blurred, but she forced them clear. She refused to let strangers see her cry. She raised the glass of water in front of her, but her hand shook, sending tiny ripples across the surface. The candle flickered. Shadows danced across the white tablecloth. She felt exposed, like someone had turned a spotlight on her failure. From 2 tables away, Marco Santoro noticed. He hadn't meant to. He was waiting for someone himself, sipping a black espresso that had long gone cold. The meeting was running late, as these things often did in his world. But when the young woman at the window bowed her head, gripping a glass as if it were the last anchor she had, he recognized the weight in her posture. He had carried it himself once, years ago, when grief had eaten his evenings whole and left nothing but silence in its wake. Marco set his cup down carefully. The porcelain met the saucer without a sound. His movements were always like that, controlled, deliberate, nothing wasted. He had learned long ago that power didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, like gravity. Claire lowered her phone, set it face down beside the napkin, and whispered to herself, "Don't make a scene." She reached for her coat. If she left now, she could still catch the last train. She would go home hungry, but at least she would escape this humiliation with what little pride she had left. Marco stood. Something in him refused to let her leave like this. Abandoned, invisible, dismissed by nothing more than a careless message from a man who didn't deserve the effort she'd made tonight. He crossed the short distance between their tables, his footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor. He stopped before she could stand, his presence steady rather than imposing. "You shouldn't go home on an empty stomach," he said, his voice low, respectful. "I'll sit with you, nothing more than that." Claire froze, startled. She lifted her eyes to meet his. His suit was dark, tailored but not flashy, a simple watch on his wrist, gold but understated. His presence felt different from the men she usually encountered. There was no performative charm, no rehearsed smile, just a quiet certainty that made the air around him feel heavier. She searched for an angle, a motive, something that would explain why a stranger would offer this. But she found none in his steady gaze. Her throat tightened. "Oui, bien." Marco gave the smallest shrug, as if the answer required no elaboration. "Because no one deserves to be left alone at a table that was meant for two." The words landed with quiet weight, like stones dropping into still water. Claire's hand loosened around her coat. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe. She gave the faintest nod, as if clutching at a branch while sinking in deep water. Marco pulled out the chair opposite hers. The candle between them flickered, casting both their faces into a fragile circle of light. Somewhere in the restaurant, someone laughed. A door opened and closed. Life continued around them, but at their table, something new and uncertain had just begun. The waiter returned, pen poised, expecting Claire to order. She kept her eyes lowered as though the menu itself was too heavy to lift. "I'll have the soup of the day," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but she masked it with a sip of water. That was the cheapest item listed, and even then, she wasn't sure she should accept it. Marco leaned back slightly in his chair, giving her space to breathe. "And I'll take the same," he told the waiter, handing back both menus before she could protest. His tone was casual, as if the decision were obvious, as if sharing a meal with a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. When the waiter left, Claire finally looked at him, defensive instincts rising. You don't have to do this. I know, Marco said gently. But no one should feel like they're sitting alone in a crowd. Claire pressed her lips together. She wanted to argue to protect what little pride she still had, but the sincerity in his eyes stopped her. There was no pity there, only recognition. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually did, assessing, calculating, judging. He was simply seeing her. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of glasses and the low hum of other tables. The restaurant felt warmer now, less hostile. The candle between them burned steadily. Finally, she asked, "Why are you here? You don't look like someone who eats alone often." Marco let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh without humor. "I was supposed to meet someone. He's late." He paused, then added, "But that's not why I stayed when I saw you." Claire's fingers tightened around her glass. "And why did you?" "Because years ago I waited at a table like this," he said. His voice was steady, but the faint shadow in his expression revealed the memory still lived inside him. "She never came. I remember what that silence feels like." Claire blinked. The words cut through her defenses like a blade through paper. For a moment, she saw not a stranger in an expensive suit, but another person who understood the quiet humiliation of being forgotten. The soup arrived, steam curling into the air between them. Claire wrapped her hands around the bowl, grateful for the warmth more than the food itself. Her fingers had been cold all evening, not from the weather bar, but from the loneliness that had settled into her bones. Marco watched her carefully take the first spoonful. Then he said softly, "The man who didn't show up tonight, that's his failure, not yours. Don't carry his weight." Her throat tightened. She didn't answer, couldn't answer, but for the first time all evening, the taste of food felt like relief rather than shame. The restaurant had grown busier as the night deepened. Silverware chimed like distant bells, chairs scraped softly against polished wood, and laughter rose from larger tables where groups of friends celebrated things Claire could only imagine. She kept her shoulders tight, as if every sound reminded her she didn't belong here, in this warm place with its amber lighting and the faint scent of garlic and wine in the air. The manager, a man in a crisp vest with graying hair at his temples, approached their table with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned slightly toward Claire, his tone apologetic but firm. "Miss, I believe this table was reserved for later this evening. Perhaps?" Before the words could settle, Marco set his spoon down. The movement was small, but it carried weight. His voice was calm, but it cut through the space like a blade drawn from its sheath. "She's with me. This table will do just fine." The manager straightened immediately. His eyes flicked from Claire to Marco, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition dawning, followed by respect that bordered on deference. "Of course, Don Santoro," the manager said quickly, his voice dropping to a more respectful register. "Please take all the time you need. My apologies for the interruption." He retreated with a slight bow, and Claire felt the temperature at the table change. She froze, the name striking her like a cold draft. Santoro. She had heard that name before, whispered in corners, mentioned in passing by people who worked in parts of the city she never ventured into. The kind of name that carried weight in rooms where power was measured not in dollars, but in influence and fear. Her gaze shifted back to him, searching his face with new eyes. The tailored suit, the quiet composure, the way the staff bent around him like reeds in a current. It all fit now, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling. "You," her voice was barely a whisper, "you're Marco Santoro." He gave the smallest nod, as though the fact meant less to him than the steam rising from his untouched bowl. "Does it change what we're doing right now, two people sharing a meal?" Claire's hands tightened around her napkin. Heat rushed to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the sense of being tricked, even unintentionally. Everything she thought she understood about this moment shifted beneath her like sand. "I thought you were just someone who understood," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't belong at this table, not with you." She pushed back her chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. A couple at the next table glanced over, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Marco didn't reach out to stop her. He simply said, steady and low, "Don't let one bad text or my name decide your worth tonight." But Claire shook her head. To her, his words sounded too much like mercy, and mercy felt too close to pity. She grabbed her coat, her pulse loud in her ears, and turned toward the door. The rain outside waited for her, cold and unforgiving. The moment Claire stepped outside, the night swallowed her whole. Rain hit the pavement in silver streaks, soaking through her coat within seconds. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders, but the chill cut through anyway, reaching deep into her chest where something harder than cold had settled. The restaurant's warm glow fell behind her like a world she had never belonged to, a place where men like Marco Santoro sat in circles of candlelight, while people like her counted subway fare in their pockets. She hurried toward the subway entrance, clutching her purse as if it could shield her from the humiliation pressing in from all sides. Her shoes splashed through shallow puddles, the sound lost beneath the hiss of traffic and the drumming of rain against metal scaffolding. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, the electronic board above the platform flickered its verdict. Last train departed. Her breath caught. That $5 bill in her purse was all she had. Not enough for a taxi, not enough for a mistake, not enough for anything except the long walk home through streets that felt less safe with every passing hour. She leaned against the cold metal rail, rainwater dripping from her hair, and swallowed the panic rising in her throat like bile. Back above ground, the streets were nearly empty. Cars hissed past, their headlights blinding for a second before leaving her in darkness again. She pressed herself against the brick wall of a closed shop, trying to decide which direction felt less dangerous, which route home might spare her from the kind of attention a woman alone at night never wanted. And then a shadow stretched across the sidewalk. A black umbrella tilted over her head, shielding her from the downpour. Claire turned sharply, her heart hammering. Marco stood beside her, not in the polished image of power she'd seen in the restaurant, but simply a man holding an old umbrella. Its edges were frayed, the handle worn smooth by years of use. He wasn't flanked by guards or stepping out of an expensive car. He was just there, quiet and present. "You'll freeze out here," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the rain. His breath misted in the cold air. He didn't offer a car, didn't flash status, didn't insist on anything. Just the umbrella, held steady above her head. For a long moment, Claire couldn't move. Pride told her to step away, to refuse this kindness, because accepting it felt like admitting she needed help. But exhaustion rooted her in place, and the cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she couldn't remember what warmth felt like anymore. Finally, she exhaled, a small, defeated sound, and let the umbrella's shelter cover her shoulders. They began walking, neither rushing nor speaking much. The city around them was reduced to the sound of rain drumming against fabric, the soft glow of street lamps bouncing off wet pavement, and the distant wail of sirens cutting through the night. Claire's steps slowed as the adrenaline drained from her body, leaving only the weight of the evening behind. She felt hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away, and she was still trying to figure out what was missing. Marco glanced at her once, his profile sharp in the sodium light. "I didn't stay because I felt sorry for you," he said quietly. "I stayed because I've been where you are, waiting and leaving with nothing but an empty chair." She didn't answer, but her grip on her purse loosened slightly. The tension in her shoulders eased just enough for her to realize how tightly she'd been holding herself together. For the first time that night, she wasn't entirely alone. Rain softened to a mist as they entered the small park a block away. The path was slick with puddles that reflected the distorted glow of lamplight. Claire walked just inside the shelter of Marco's umbrella, close enough to avoid the rain, far enough to keep her guard intact. Her voice broke the silence first, small but determined. "I shouldn't have stayed at that table. You didn't have to do any of this." Marco's steps slowed. He adjusted the umbrella slightly, angling it more toward her. "I didn't have to," he agreed, "but I wanted to. Not because of who I am, because of who you are." Claire frowned, her brow furrowing. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied, his tone matter of fact. "You showed up tonight. You believe someone would too. That's more than most people manage." The words lingered in the air between them, carried on the mist. Claire bit her lip, feeling a knot in her chest tighten and ease at the same time. She wanted to argue, to dismiss it as politeness or strategy, but the way he said it, calm, certain, without flattery, made it impossible to deflect. As they crossed the park, Marco angled the umbrella further toward her, letting the damp air soak his shoulder. The fabric of his suit darkened where the rain touched it. Claire noticed and shook her head. "You'll get sick." He gave a faint smile, the first real expression she'd seen crack through his composed exterior. "I've weathered worse." They stopped near the stone steps that led down toward her neighborhood. Neon from a corner store flickered in the distance, casting red and blue across the wet pavement. Claire hesitated, her hand resting on the cold metal railing. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Tonight you reminded me I wasn't invisible. Thank you." Marco looked at her for a long second as if weighing something unsaid. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Finally he nodded. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "Don't let that text be the last word." The rain picked up again, rattling against the umbrella like distant applause. Claire swallowed hard, unable to answer. She only managed to nod before stepping down the stairs toward the dim streets below, her footsteps echoing in the empty night. Marco stayed at the top, the old umbrella tilted above him. He watched until her figure disappeared into the shadows, a small shape swallowed by the city. For Claire, the night wasn't ending as planned. It wasn't ending with humiliation either. Somewhere in between, something unexpected had begun to take root. The next morning, the city hummed with its usual chaos. Horns blared, footsteps rushed past on crowded sidewalks, and the faint smell of coffee and rain-soaked asphalt hung in the air. Claire sat by the window of her small studio apartment, her scrubs folded neatly beside her for the upcoming night shift. She replayed the night in fragments, the cruel text that had shattered her evening, the weight of the soup spoon in her hand, Marco's voice telling her not to let that message define her worth. She wanted to forget, to file it away as just another disappointment in a long line of them. But his words wouldn't let her. Her phone buzzed against the windowsill, a text from a colleague at the hospital. "Extra shift tonight," one nurse called out. "Can you cover?" Claire sighed, her shoulders dropping. Another 12 hours meant more exhaustion, darker circles under her eyes. Another day where sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But it also meant money she desperately needed. Rent was due in a week, and her account balance mocked her every time she checked it. She typed back quickly, "I'll take it." Across town, in an office that overlooked steel towers and cranes rising against the gray sky, Marco sat at a desk that had belonged to his father. The room was nothing like the glass and chrome spaces that dominated modern business. Dark wood paneled the walls. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. A single lamp cast amber shadows across stacks of papers and an old rotary phone that still worked better than any cell. His assistant, a man named Rocco, who had been with the family for 20 years, listed the day's obligations. Meetings with suppliers, conversations that needed to happen in private rooms where handshakes meant more than contracts. But Marco's mind kept drifting. He remembered Claire's trembling hands, her insistence on paying her own way, her stubborn dignity even when the world had tried to strip it from her. At lunch, instead of dining with associates in one of the private rooms above the restaurant, he walked into the same Italian place where they'd met. The manager greeted him with exaggerated courtesy, but Marco's eyes swept the room, almost expecting to see Claire again. Of course, she wasn't there. That evening, fate intervened in the way it sometimes does when the universe decides two paths should cross again. Claire, halfway through her shift, was wheeling supplies down the corridor when she nearly collided with a tall man in a dark suit. He was speaking with members of the hospital board, his presence commanding attention even in a place where doctors held authority. Marco Santoro. Her heart stuttered. She froze, clutching the cart as if it could anchor her to the ground. He turned, and surprise flickered across his face before softening into something warmer. Something that made the sterile hospital hallway feel less cold. "You work here?" Marco asked gently, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. Claire's cheeks burned. "Yes, I told you I'm a nurse. Night shifts mostly." He nodded slowly as if pieces of a puzzle had just fallen into place. Around them, the corridor buzzed with voices, machines beeping their rhythms, the shuffle of hurried footsteps. Yet the moment felt oddly still, like they were standing in the eye of a storm. "I didn't come here looking for you," he said carefully, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But I'm not sorry I found you." Claire's lips parted, unsure how to respond. The walls she had built, class, money, pride, wavered under the weight of his sincerity. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress her or win something from her. He was simply being honest. Before she could speak, a pager blared overhead, harsh and insistent. She glanced at her badge, already turning toward the sound. "I have to go," she said quickly. Marco didn't stop her. He only said, quiet but certain, "Then I'll wait." And for the first time in a long while, someone truly did. Marco waited, not at the hospital entrance where cameras might notice him, where his presence might draw the kind of attention that followed men like him everywhere. Instead, he found his way to the small cafeteria tucked away on the ground floor, a place where the fluorescent lights hummed too loud and the coffee tasted like regret. Hours passed. The hum of vending machines filled the silence, punctuated by the faint clatter of trays and the occasional shuffle of exhausted staff grabbing food between shifts. Marco sat at a corner table, his jacket folded neatly over the chair beside him, his tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd been there a while. It was nearly midnight when Claire finally walked in. Exhaustion was etched into every line of her face, dark circles beneath her eyes, her hair tied back in a ponytail that had come loose during the shift. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled, a small stain on the sleeve from where a patient had grabbed her arm too tightly. But her posture was steady. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived another night of holding other people's lives together while her own threatened to fall apart. She blinked when she saw him there, still in his tailored suit, still waiting. Disbelief threaded through her voice. "You stayed?" Marco lifted a simple paper cup, steam still rising from the surface. "Coffee's terrible here," he said with the faintest hint of a smile. "But I thought it might be better shared." Claire's lips curved despite herself, the first genuine smile she'd managed in days. She sat across from him, her hands wrapping around the cup he pushed toward her. The warmth seeped into her palms, and for a moment she just held it, letting the heat remind her that she was still alive, still present. For a long stretch, neither spoke. The quiet of the cafeteria seemed to belong only to them, a pocket of stillness carved out of the chaos that defined their lives. Finally, Claire broke the silence, her voice soft but edged with confusion. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." Marco leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes steady on hers. "It's not about owing, it's about recognizing someone who deserves to be seen." Her throat tightened. She wanted to dismiss it, to protect herself with the armor of skepticism she'd built over years of disappointment. But the sincerity in his gaze pinned her in place. He wasn't here as a man of power. He wasn't here as someone looking for gratitude or leverage. He was simply present, offering something she hadn't realized she'd been starving for: acknowledgement. They spoke in fragments after that, about long shifts and short tempers, about his son, Matteo, who loved building elaborate structures out of anything he could find, who asked questions Marco didn't always know how to answer, about the patience Claire carried home in her thoughts, the way she remembered every patient's name even when they forgot hers. With every exchange, the distance between their worlds seemed to shrink. Not vanish, it was still there, vast and undeniable, but narrow enough for a bridge to form, fragile and uncertain but real. When the hospital intercom announced the next shift change, Claire stood reluctantly. "I should go back." Marco nodded, but his next words stopped her in her tracks. "Claire, last night I saw someone trying not to cry into a glass of water. Tonight I see someone holding an entire ward together with less sleep than most people could handle." He paused, letting the words settle. "That's the version of you I want to know better." Claire froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time in years, someone had noticed not her flaws, not her struggles, but her strength. Not what she lacked, but what she carried. She left without answering, her steps quick down the corridor, but as she walked back to the noise and urgency of the ward, she realized her hands were no longer trembling. The hospital cafeteria encounter lingered in Claire's mind like a melody she couldn't shake. His words, "the version of you I want to know better," followed her down sterile hallways, replaying against the steady hum of monitors and the shuffle of tired footsteps. The next evening, Marco appeared again. Not in a suit this time, but in a simple dark shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He wasn't there to intrude or demand attention. He waited in the visitor's lounge, reading a newspaper that was 2 days old, a man who seemed strangely at home among the restless air of a place defined by waiting. Claire spotted him during her break. She paused in the doorway, her hands still cold from washing them for the 100th time that shift. "You can't keep showing up like this," she said softly, trying to sound stern but failing. Marco folded the paper with deliberate care. "I'm not here to make a scene, just to remind you that you don't have to go through all of this unseen." Before she could respond, a voice cut through the moment. "Mr. Santoro?" Claire turned sharply. One of her supervisors, Dr. Ellison, stood nearby, eyes flicking between them with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The tone in his voice made it clear. Marco's reputation preceded him, even here in a place supposedly separate from the shadows he moved through. Claire felt her chest tighten. This was exactly what she feared. Her personal life bleeding into her professional world, coloring how people saw her, reducing her to someone's connection rather than someone in her own right. When Dr. Ellison walked away, Claire exhaled sharply, her voice barely controlled. "Do you know what it looks like? You showing up here, waiting for me in my workplace? People talk, Marco. I don't need whispers following me down these halls." Marco's expression softened, but he didn't look away. He nodded slowly, not defensive, just thoughtful. "Then tell me where to stand so I can be near without casting a shadow on you." Her lips parted, words caught in her throat. No one had ever asked her that. Not a boyfriend who drifted away when her hours got longer. Not friends who'd stopped calling when she couldn't keep up with their lives. They always took space, rarely offered it. Still, she shook her head, her voice tight. "It's not that simple." But as she walked back to her shift, Claire realized something unsettling. It was simple. The real complication was the way his presence made her feel, seen, steady, even hopeful. And hope, she'd learned, was the most dangerous thing a person like her could carry. Later that night, long after the shift had ended and the city had settled into its restless sleep, Marco left something on the cafeteria table where Claire often sat during breaks. A folded note, plain white paper. Nothing elaborate, just a sentence in neat, deliberate handwriting. "The world may watch, but only you decide how you are remembered." Claire found it at 3 in the morning, her hands trembling as she read it alone under the harsh fluorescent lights. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the whispers she feared felt less heavy than the silence she used to live in. Rumors did spread, the way they always do, in places where people have too much time and too little information. Claire heard them in fragments, pieces of conversations that stopped when she walked into the break room. The way 2 interns fell silent mid-sentence, their eyes darting away too quickly. The whispers that followed her down corridors like shadows. The nurse with the billionaire, it wasn't cruel, not yet, but it made her skin prickle with unease, made her hyper-aware of every glance, every pause in conversation when she entered a room. That unease deepened when she returned to her tiny apartment late one night and found her sister Anna waiting outside her door. Anna had driven in from New Jersey without warning, worry written across her face in lines that made her look older than her years. "Claire, is it true?" Anna asked before Claire could even set down her bag. "People are saying you're seeing Marco Santoro. The Marco Santoro." Claire's throat tightened. She fumbled with her keys, avoiding her sister's gaze. "We're not—" She stopped, unsure how to explain what even she couldn't define. "It's complicated." Anna pressed on, following her inside the cramped studio. "Do you know what kind of spotlight that puts on you? On us? You've worked so hard to keep your life steady, to stay invisible enough to breathe. And now," she shook her head, "men like him don't save women like us, Claire. They ruin them when the cameras turn." The words cut deeper than Claire expected. She had lived in the shadows her entire life. Low wages, long shifts, sleepless nights. She had built her existence carefully, brick by brick, not for glamour or recognition, but for survival, for the quiet dignity of making it through another day without breaking. And yet, Marco's voice echoed in her memory. "I want to know the version of you that holds everything together." "What if he's different?" Claire asked quietly, more to herself than to Anna. Anna's expression softened with something like pity. They're never different, Claire. Not when the world gets involved. The following evening, Claire confronted him outside the hospital. He had been waiting again, patient as stone, a man with time when the world assumed he had none. My sister thinks this will end with me humiliated, Claire said, her voice steady but sharp. My colleagues whisper like I've done something wrong. Marco, I can't carry their judgment on top of everything else. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His gaze held hers, unwavering, searching for something beneath her words. Claire, he said finally, his voice low and deliberate, if you need me to disappear, I will. But understand this, your worth doesn't vanish because others are too small to see it. If you walk away from me, let it be because you don't want me, not because they told you not to. Her breath caught. He had placed the choice squarely in her hands. Not his influence, not his reputation, not public opinion, just hers. Claire turned away, her steps faltering. For the first time, she realized the silence she'd always hidden behind might be the very thing breaking her apart. And the question wasn't whether she could survive the storm of being seen. It was whether she was brave enough to step into it at all. The week that followed dragged like a storm cloud over Claire's head. Every corridor at the hospital felt narrower, every conversation shorter, every glance more loaded with meaning. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they grew louder, fed by curiosity and speculation. Yet Marco kept his distance. No surprise visits, no notes left on cafeteria tables, just absence that felt heavier than presence ever had. Claire told herself it was what she wanted, what she'd asked for. But at night, alone in her apartment with the city noise filtering through thin walls, she felt the weight of that absence pressing against her chest. One evening after another double shift, Claire walked out into the dusky glow of the city. Her body begged for rest, her feet aching in shoes that had seen too many miles of hospital floors. She pulled her coat tighter against the autumn chill and stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for the light to change. Across the street, she saw him. Marco leaned against a black Alfa Romeo, its paint gleaming under the street lamps. Not his usual car, she realized. Something more understated, less likely to draw attention. He didn't approach. He simply waited, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. He was giving her the decision. Claire's heart hammered. The light changed, people brushed past her, but she stood frozen on the curb. She thought of Anna's warning, the whispers at work, her carefully built life of silence and survival. Then she thought of his words. If you walk away, let it be because you don't want me. Finally, she crossed the street. Her steps were uncertain at first, then steadier as the distance closed between them. You stayed away, she said, her breath uneven. Marco nodded, his dark eyes never leaving hers. You asked me not to cast a shadow. I tried. He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his usually composed features. But I won't pretend I don't care. For a long beat, neither moved. The traffic lights changed, spilling red and green reflections onto wet pavement. A taxi honked somewhere down the block. The world continued its relentless motion around them, but in that moment, they existed in a pocket of stillness. Claire thought of everything she stood to lose, her anonymity, her careful distance from complications, the safety of being unseen. Then she thought of what she might gain, the possibility of being known, truly known, by someone who saw past her exhaustion to the strength underneath. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but certain. I don't want to be defined by fear anymore. Marco's jaw tightened, relief flickering across his features like light breaking through clouds. He opened the car door but didn't press her, didn't assume. His voice was soft, almost tentative. Then let me take you somewhere. Not as who the world thinks I am, just as Marco. Claire hesitated only a moment before sliding into the passenger seat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and rain, clean and simple. As the car pulled away from the curb, she glanced at him, his profile steady against the fading light. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't running from something. She was choosing it. For a few days, the world seemed quieter. Marco and Claire found small, private moments carved out of their impossible schedules. A walk in the park where early morning mist clung to the grass. Late night coffee at a tucked away diner where the waitress knew Marco by name but never asked questions. Each time he let her set the pace, never pushing, never assuming more than she was willing to give. For the first time in years, Claire felt a life not built on fear and survival, but on choice. That calm shattered on a Thursday morning. Claire arrived at the hospital to find her photo plastered across a gossip site on a colleague's phone. The screen glowed with a headline that felt like a slap. Mystery nurse seen with notorious Marco Santoro. Who is she? Beneath it, grainy pictures showed her stepping into his car, her tired scrubs visible under her coat, her face caught in profile. The captions speculated wildly about who she was, what she wanted, whether she knew what kind of man she was tangling with. Whispers no longer stayed in corners. They followed her down corridors, into patient rooms, through the break room where conversations died the moment she entered. A supervisor pulled her aside mid-shift, his expression tight with professional concern. Claire, we value professionalism here. Associations like these, they complicate things, they raise questions. Her chest tightened. Everything she feared was here, manifesting in real time. Public eyes stripping away her dignity, reducing her to a headline, a curiosity, a cautionary tale. That evening she confronted Marco. He was waiting outside the hospital again, but this time his expression was taut, concern carved into the lines around his eyes. "They're using me to humiliate you," Claire said, her voice trembling with contained anger. "Everything I built here, my work, my name, it's turning into a circus. Do you understand that?" Marco stepped closer, but his voice stayed calm, measured. "Claire, I never wanted this for you, but walking away won't silence them. It will only confirm their story, give them the ending they're already writing." Her breath caught. "So what do I do? Smile for cameras I never asked for? Pretend I belong in a world I don't understand?" Marco's answer came slowly, like each word cost him something. "No, you don't pretend. But you can decide. Either let them dictate the story or write your own." It wasn't reassurance. It was a challenge, one that demanded more courage than Claire was sure she possessed. She turned away, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time, she realized that being with Marco wasn't just about trust or affection. It was about whether she was willing to step into a storm that could either break her or finally prove her strength to a world that had never bothered to notice her before. The fallout came fast and merciless. By the next morning, Claire's name was on every gossip blog that thrived on rumor and scandal. "The billionaire and the nurse," one headline sneered, as if her life were a punchline. "Santoro's latest charity case," another suggested, the words dripping with contempt. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues, old classmates, even distant neighbors who hadn't spoken to her in years. Everyone suddenly had opinions about her life, her choices, her worth. At the hospital, the whispers turned sharper, more pointed. Two patients' families refused her care, insisting on someone less distracted. Her supervisor's tone grew clipped, his patience wearing thin under pressure from the board. "Claire, you need to get ahead of this," he said during a tense meeting in his office. "Otherwise, we'll have no choice but to reevaluate your position here." The words landed like a verdict. Years of training, sleepless nights, and sacrifices reduced to tabloid fodder. Her career hanging by a thread because she'd accepted a bowl of soup from a stranger who turned out to be more than he appeared. That night, she met Marco at a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. No cameras, no staff hovering nearby, just them in a corner booth where the lighting was dim and the coffee was strong. She dropped the newspaper on the table between them, the headline glaring up at them like an accusation. "This is my life now," she said, her voice low but trembling. "Every patient, every colleague, every person I serve, they'll see me as her, not as Claire, just the woman in your shadow." Marco didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice steady, almost raw. "Then let's take back the shadow. Tell the truth before they decide it for you, oh." Claire shook her head, frustration boiling over. "You don't understand. You have people who manage these things, lawyers who spin stories in your favor, a name that bends reality around it. All I have is a badge, a paycheck that barely covers rent, and a reputation I just lost." He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he spoke, his voice quieter but no less certain. "Claire, I can't erase the storm, but I can stand in it with you if you'll let me." Her hands tightened around the newspaper, crinkling the edges. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back, refusing to break here in this public place. She thought of Anna's warnings, of her supervisor's cold stare, of patients refusing her care because of who she'd been photographed with. For once, she wanted to stop running, to stop shrinking herself to fit into spaces that barely acknowledged her existence. But could she? Did she have that kind of courage? Marco reached across the table, not to grab her hand, but to slide a folded page toward her, a draft of a statement he'd written but never released. Not polished by professionals, not sanitized for public consumption, just his own words, open unfiltered. The first line read, "She is not my scandal. She is my equal." Claire's breath caught. She looked at him, then at the page, then back at him. In that moment, she realized the storm wasn't only about her dignity or her career. It was about whether she was willing to step into the light at all, to claim space in a world that had always told her she didn't belong. Claire sat with that folded page in her hands long after Marco had left the cafe, giving her space to think. The words on it weighed more than the paper could carry. "She is my equal." They were too bold, too exposed, too much like a line that could change the entire trajectory of her carefully constructed life. Back at the hospital, the pressure mounted like water behind a dam. Her supervisor called her in again, closing the office door with a click that echoed like a gavel. "Claire, the board is concerned. Until this settles, we're considering suspension. Patients are asking questions we can't ignore, and frankly, the attention is disruptive." Suspension wasn't just about lost pay. It was about losing the trust she had built, shift by shift, night by night. It was about her name being tainted by association, her years of work reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. That evening, she stood at her apartment window, rain streaking the glass, the city lights blurred like her future. Anna sat across the room, arms crossed, worry etched in every line of her face. "Claire," Anna said gently, carefully, "this isn't just about him anymore. It's about whether you're ready to live in a world where everyone has an opinion about you, where your life isn't your own." Claire turned from the window, her voice breaking but steady underneath. "They already have opinions. They've already taken my name and twisted it into something I don't recognize. If I stay quiet, I let them keep it. If I speak, maybe I get it back. Maybe I finally become more than just someone who takes orders and disappears at the end of a shift." Anna's expression softened, a mixture of fear and admiration in her eyes. The next morning, Claire walked into the hospital not in her scrubs, but in plain clothes. A simple dress, her hair down, her shoulders back. Murmurs followed her down the corridor like a wave. She passed the nurses' station, the waiting families, the patients who stared a moment too long. Each step felt heavier yet sharper, like she was cutting her own path through territory that had never belonged to her. Marco was waiting outside the hospital entrance. No entourage, no expensive car, just him standing in the morning light, patient as stone. When their eyes met, the tension that had coiled around Claire's chest loosened just a fraction. "You're ready?" he asked, his voice quiet. Claire nodded, clutching the folded page he'd given her. Her voice was calm, almost defiant. "We tell them all of it." They walked side by side toward the press that had begun to gather, drawn by rumors that something was about to happen. Cameras raised like weapons. Flashbulbs sparked in the gray morning light. Questions shouted over each other in an incomprehensible roar. For a moment, Claire wanted to run. Then Marco spoke, his voice steady, carrying across the crowd with an authority that demanded attention. "She is not a story for you to twist. She is not my scandal. She is my equal." Gasps rippled through the press line. The microphone swiveled toward Claire, hungry for her response. This was the moment she'd feared, the moment she'd avoided her entire life. Her palms were damp, her heart hammering, but she lifted her chin and looked directly into the cameras. "My name is Claire Morgan," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I am a nurse. I work night shifts. I save lives. I have nothing to be ashamed of, and I won't apologize for being seen. The crowd erupted, questions, shouts, cameras, snapping so fast it sounded like rainfall. But beneath the chaos, something had shifted. Claire felt it in the way Marco stood firm beside her, not in front of her, but with her. In the way the words she spoke seemed to echo louder than the noise trying to drown them out. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding. She was choosing to stand, and that made all the difference. The courtyard outside the hospital became a storm of flashing lights and shouted questions. Microphones thrust forward like weapons, reporters pushing closer, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Are you in a relationship, Claire? Did you pursue him for money? Marco, is this your attempt at damage control? Claire's heart pounded, but Marco's presence beside her was steady. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, not leading, simply there. An anchor if she chose to take it. She didn't. Not yet. This was her moment, her voice. I didn't pursue anyone, Claire said, her voice cutting through the clamor with unexpected strength. I work night shifts. I live paycheck to paycheck. What happened between us wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was just real. And I won't let anyone twist it into something dirty. The press pressed harder, sensing blood in the water. The crowd grew restless, feeding on the tension. Then a woman's voice cut through the noise. Claire! It was Anna, pushing through the throng of reporters and cameras. She had resisted this from the beginning, wary of Marco, protective of her sister, afraid of what this exposure might do. But now, seeing Claire standing in front of a wall of cameras with her spine unbent, Anna's expression shifted. Pride, fear, and love flickered together in her eyes. She stepped up beside Claire, not speaking, just standing there. A silent statement of solidarity. Marco finally spoke again, his tone firm, measured, carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to being questioned, but willing to answer anyway. You've all built your headlines on shadows and speculation. But here's the truth. Claire isn't here because of me. I'm here because of her. Because I recognize something I lost a long time ago. The courage to stand even when the ground shakes beneath you. The crowd quieted just for a beat. His words landed heavier than expected, genuine in a way that cameras couldn't fake. Yet not everyone was convinced. A reporter in the front row sneered, his voice dripping with skepticism. Easy words for a man with your kind of power. But what happens when your associates see this as weakness, when they question your judgment? Marco didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, unwavering. If integrity is weakness, then we need more of it everywhere. In business, in power, in life. The words sparked murmurs through the crowd, some supportive, others skeptical. The battle wasn't over, but a line had been drawn. Back inside, after security finally ushered the press away, Claire leaned against the cool wall of the corridor. Every muscle in her body trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline. She felt hollowed out and somehow more solid at the same time. Anna stood beside her, arms still folded but her expression softer now. You didn't run, she said quietly, almost in disbelief. I'm done running, Claire whispered back. I've spent my whole life making myself small enough to fit through doors that barely opened for me. I'm tired, Anna. I'm so tired of being invisible. Marco stepped closer, his voice low, private. This won't calm down overnight. It may get worse before it gets better. But if you stand, I'll stand with you. Every day, every storm. Claire looked at him, exhaustion and clarity blending in her gaze. She saw not the shadow she'd feared becoming lost in, but a man willing to step into the light alongside her, risking his own reputation for something as simple and complicated as honesty. Then we stand, she said, and this time her voice didn't waver. The following weeks tested every word they had spoken. Headlines came and went like weather patterns. Some were cruel, mocking Claire for reaching above her station. Others were unexpectedly supportive, praising her courage for standing up to public scrutiny. Marco's world, the one built on respect and carefully maintained distance, bristled at first. Associates questioned his judgment. Old allies wondered if he'd gone soft. But when the dust began to settle, something unexpected happened. People respected the stand he'd taken. Not everyone, but enough. Integrity, it turned out, still mattered to some, and Claire's refusal to be shamed resonated with more people than the gossip sites wanted to admit. At the hospital, Claire carried on with her shifts. Patients still needed care. Babies still cried in the maternity ward. IV alarms still beeped through the night, marking time in a place where every second mattered. But something subtle had shifted. She was no longer just the nurse walking quickly through corridors. Head down, invisible. People saw her differently now. Some with suspicion, yes, but many with a new kind of respect. She had stood in front of cameras and claimed her own story. That took a kind of strength that couldn't be taught. One crisp autumn morning, Marco arrived at the hospital courtyard. Not in a car surrounded by people managing his image, but alone, holding that same worn black umbrella that had once shielded Claire from the rain. He waited until her shift ended, patient as always. Claire stepped outside into the cool air, fatigue in her eyes, but also a steadiness that hadn't been there months ago. She saw him and felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly, pulling her coat tighter. "Pulling me into this storm?" Marco shook his head without hesitation. "I don't regret seeing you," when the world looked away. They walked together through the park where their first honest conversation had unfolded. Golden leaves scattered across the path, crunching underfoot. The air smelled of rain and earth and the particular melancholy of autumn. Then, just as naturally as breathing, Marco stopped. He turned to face her, the umbrella hanging loosely at his side. "Matteo keeps asking when you'll come for dinner again," he said, a smile tugging at the edge of his usually composed expression. "I'd like the answer to be always." Claire's throat tightened. No grand speeches came to her, no carefully prepared words, just the quiet certainty that she didn't need to keep running, didn't need to keep making herself smaller, to fit into a world that had never quite had space for her. She placed her hand in his, fingers trembling, slightly but sure. From a distance, Anna watched, leaning against the park fence. She didn't interfere, didn't call out. She saw her sister's choice, and for the first time since this all began, she let herself smile. The world seemed to pull back, giving them this moment. Claire, Marco, and soon Matteo, who would join them for a dinner that felt like the beginning of something neither had dared to hope for. The umbrella swung loosely at Marco's side, no longer a shield against the storm, but a keepsake. A reminder of the night when two people found each other in the rain and decided that being seen was worth whatever storms might come. They walked the leaf-strewn path together, their steps in sync, heading toward whatever came next. Not perfect, not without challenges, but together. And sometimes that was enough.